In today's class, we're going to be starting with a quote that's really important to me. I think it was Augustine that said it. He said, "A religion should not be judged by its abuses." And so I wanted to mention that first as we get started because in the process of trying to communicate the events as they transpired to you, I want to make sure that I clearly fall outside of the scope of communicating that I agree with the way things went down. I don't necessarily, I don't agree with how Christ was represented to the New World, but I think it's important to be clear about what actually occurred. And so the goal for the class is to kind of cover the history of it. And in our desire to give the history of the church, there's a lot of things in the church that occurred in the name of Christ or in the name of the church that I feel no need to defend or explain or apologize for, because I don't agree with how it was done, nor am I the people or persons who perpetrated the incidents in question. I look at the past and I say that was horrible. Shouldn't have been done. Shouldn't have been done at all. And definitely should not have been done that way. It was a gross misrepresentation of the heart of Christ and of the scriptures. And so, but that doesn't mean that, I should try to defend it or explain it away or pretend it didn't occur. The purpose of this class is to look at the history of the church, and the goal of looking at the history of the church is in large measure that we should learn from it, that we wouldn't fall into the same mistakes, the same ways of thinking, that we should, learn to set foundations in our own lives that are stronger, that are more scriptural, that are truer to the heart of Christ, and avoid many of the pitfalls and shortcomings of those who've gone before us. So that being said, as we look at the spread of Christianity to the New World, I'm reminded of the fact that Christopher Columbus left for the New World 8 years after the birth of Martin Luther. So these guys were contemporaries for the most part. There was a couple years difference between them, about 8 years difference between them. But while Christopher Columbus is discovering this new world, Martin Luther is growing up, is struggling with the priesthood, his monastic orders, and is a few years into the discovery of the new world. The Reformation is getting started. So another thing that's worth noting is that in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull giving permission for Spain to conquer the West and for Portugal to conquer the East. And so that kind of language is really tough to our ears. Like, what entitles a person, to give permission to, arbitrarily it would seem, give permission to two countries to conquer the world, to kind of divvy it up. And hopefully if that's something that you're curious about, you can go back and listen to the previous classes that we have on the Middle Ages and previous. He drew an imaginary line from north to south, right down the Azore Islands. And he told Spain, you can have everything to the west, and Portugal, that they could have everything to the east. That line was later adjusted to give Portugal permission to conquer Brazil and to have a colony there, to colonize Brazil. And so these early Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, they were definitely motivated by a desire for financial wealth, for fame, for political gain. They were all after power. They were after a lot of stuff. But there was also, even from the very beginning, some measure of religious intention to what they were doing, a sense of a religious mission that they brought to the table. Now, I can't go into the heart of people and be able to distinguish exactly how much of that was genuine and how much of that was contrived to serve their own political means and ends, to give kind of a motivation or a heart to what they were really trying to accomplish. I can't draw those lines, but I can say that they were from the outset saying that they had some measure of religious intention that they were bringing to their actions. Now, again, looking at a lot of these actions, a lot of these things, most of these things, if not most of all of these things, many of them were very much contrary to the heart of Christ, as we see revealed in Scripture. So these conquistadors, or Spanish, that's Spanish for conquerors, they were often joined by Dominican, Franciscan, and later by Jesuit orders of the monastic orders that came with a goal or a purpose of converting the locals to the Catholic Church. So they came along with them. One of the practices that we struggle with a lot now that they did was forced baptisms. They forced a lot of these locals and natives to be baptized, and we see that very much contrary to the Scripture. And I don't defend or justify that at all. It's totally wrong. But I do think it's worth noting that they didn't invent the idea of forced baptisms. Charlemagne was doing forced baptisms way before that. So this is not something that they came up with, but they did bring some of these kind of practices from the Middle Ages to the New World. And so it's also worth noting that a lot of these monastic orders and representations there of the church, there were many within it that were trying to preserve the culture of the people that they came to evangelize. That doesn't often get spoken about. But there were, even from within the monastic orders, people that were saying, listen, you got to preserve these people's culture. It's not right for us to enslave them. They're human beings just like we are. And those people often get lost in the telling of history. We prefer, clearer lines than that. But there were within these movements people that said, listen, this isn't right the way that we're treating them. And there were within these movements people who were trying to protect the lives of the Native American Indians, and often they did so at the expense of their own lives. They were very much persecuted and oppressed for their attempts to do that. And I think it's worth mentioning them because it was to their own peril that they did so, and it wouldn't be fair to leave them out of the narrative, and that often happens. We often neglect these people. Among them was Antonio Montesinos, who was a Dominican. He protested the encomienda, which was a way that an early way in which the Spanish and Portuguese tried to kind of bring the Native Americans into what was basically the feudal system that they had from the Middle Ages. They tried to kind of institute it, but it very quickly, if not immediately, devolved into slavery and oppression and cruelty. And this guy, Antonio Montesinos, was a Dominican monk, and he, vocally protested the way that they were treating the Native American Indians at the time. Also, Bartholomew de las Casas, who was also a Dominican, a champion of Indian rights. José de Anchieta was a Jesuit in Brazil that also was trying to protect the Indians from the New World, the Old World people that were coming in. In that case, it would be the Portuguese. And then Antonio Vieira of Brazil, their resolution to this issue was to try to, these last two guys were Jesuits, and they were trying to have the Indians kind of set apart in this area where they would be protected, called reductions. So those are some of the people that were representing the culture and trying to lend some measure of value to the lives of the Native American Indians that were there, to the minds of the people that were coming in to conquer them, that really viewed them in a very demeaning and vicious and cruel way. So you look at Hernan Cortez. He left Spain in 1511. He began an expedition against the Aztecs in Mexico. Supported by 700 fellow Spaniards and thousands of Indian allies. The Aztecs were very brutal towards other Indians that were in that area. So when the Spaniards came in, a lot of, thousands of other local Indians joined the Spaniards in their conquest of the Aztecs. In 1520, he destroyed and defeated the capital of the Aztec Empire, and he built Mexico City. on top of its ruins. He made himself the governor of New Spain and the captain general of their forces in 1522. It's interesting, you make yourself the governor of New Spain. What value does a self-appointed title have? Well, his title was confirmed by Charles V, the emperor, in 1529 when he went back to Europe to visit. Pizarro took much of the same course that Hernan Cortez took, except he went towards the area of Peru. He received authority from the Spanish monarchs in 1528 through 1529 to go to the New World, and he attacked the Incas in Peru in 1530. He massacred them in Cajamarca and captured their capital of Cusco in 1530. Again, some of the horrible things that were done by them during this time period. There's so much written about it if you'd like to get more information on it. The Catholic Church was, at this point, you remember there was a big challenge, struggle, a fight that was taking place within the church about who was going to appoint church positions, people in authority in the church. Was it going to be the civil authorities? Was it going to be the Pope or the church to appoint officers within itself? And the civil authorities, or the kings and the Pope, went back and forth. They fought about this a lot. Well, when it came to the New World, the church and the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church, I should specify, and the Pope were very much occupied with what was taking place in Europe, with the Reformation, and with all these other things that were going on. So when it came to appointing church offices in the New World, the Pope readily gave permission to the monarchs of Spain and Portugal to appoint church offices for themselves. We haven't even mapped these new territories out. Why don't you just go ahead and appoint a church official to that area as you see fit? And so the kings and queens of Spain and Portugal instituted the church leadership in the New World. As I mentioned, they introduced the encomienda into the New World in 1503, where they had a kind of like a landlord-based system where the Indians were under Spanish and Portuguese landlords, and they owed them kind of servitude and labor. It was basically the feudal system, as I understand it. Introduced there in the New World, and it did not work out well. It didn't work out well in Europe either, so I'm not super surprised. But it became a haven for cruelty and oppression, slavery for the native people. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were the first monastic orders represented in the New World from 1510 onwards. But then with the second wave of conquistadors, the Jesuits became predominant in the second phase of conquest. So it's also worth noting that the Jesuits, remember what represented the Jesuits was their undying loyalty to the Pope. And so they did a great job of incorporating themselves within the government and being very much involved in the decisions that were being made and in the education of the people. They were very much entrenched in that. In Brazil and Venezuela, they were extensively influenced by the Jesuit exploits. In Central America was extensively pioneered by Franciscans, Dominicans, and Mercedarians. Mercedarians are a whole other branch of monastic order. They came into being when Muslim forces were holding people hostage. The Mercedarians were a monastic order that was instituted to go in there and try to liberate those that had been held captive by the Muslims in Europe. And at this point, this is past the primary Muslim wars. Are moving over to the New World and embarking on other quests. So these Mercedarians were very much involved in the Central America. From Mexico, Catholic missionaries, Franciscans, went northward into Lower California by 1681. And the reason why they were going northward is because they were trying to meet other branches of Christianity that were coming south. So I learned this time around. I was not aware of this, but this might be common knowledge for you. But they were coming up north. The Jesuits and the Franciscans there in Mexico were going north because the Russian Orthodox had established an enclave in Kodiak Island and in the Aleutian. I can't even pronounce it properly, but those islands there in Alaska, and so they established an enclave there, and they were coming south. The Russian Orthodox were coming south, and they went all the way down to San Francisco. There was a huge population of Russian Orthodox in San Francisco. So they had established a strong enclave in Alaska. They entered in 1741 and began work on Kodiak Island by 1794. In 2 years, thousands in Kodiak Island had thousands in the Kodiak Islands and the Aleutian, I can't say it, islands had been baptized. They had resistance from the Russian American Company, but when a Siberian priest called Innocent Veniaminov was sent there, the leadership was reinvigorated, and he did a great job of organizing the Russian Orthodox Church against the opposition it was receiving at the time. He did such an effective job that when his wife died, I should say in 1820, he translated the Gospel of Matthew into their local language. And by the time his wife died, he was appointed a bishop of that entire area from Alaska all the way down to California. And he served in that post from 1840 to 1868. In the 1870s, Alaska was sold to the United States. But by the 1900s, there was 10,000 Russian Orthodox Christians in that area. Isn't that incredible? And so also the Franciscans were moving north, and they were also moving east towards Louisiana. And there was also a lot of Jesuits that were coming down from Canada, that were coming down to evangelize, to be missionaries to the Indians there in Louisiana. So there were French Jesuits were very prevalent in Louisiana until the Jesuit expulsion. So I kind of mentioned that they were very much entrenched in politics, and there came a time, where they just everyone just started throwing the Jesuits out of their country. So there was general agitation against the Jesuit order in Europe and the colonies of the Northwest, and this led to their expulsion from the Portuguese territory in 1759, and then from Spanish possessions 8 years later. After the 7 Years' War, as we would call it, the French-Indian War, French Canada became British, and Jesuits were banned from the New World as well. So they weren't reintroduced again until 1814. If you'd like more information on that, I found that really interesting. They were all kind of thrown out, systematically thrown out and pulled out of every country that they were in for a while. And really, as best as I can figure, it was just their involvement in matters of political intrigue was so prevalent that the only way people knew how to take the power away from them was just kind of get rid of them out of their country. And so that happened right around that time period. Just year after year, you see nations just kind of throwing all the Jesuits out. It wasn't until after the Napoleonic Wars that the Pope at the time allowed the Jesuits to go back into countries and get involved again. So we'll stop there, and then in the next class, we will look at the Puritan movement, the English separatist movement that colonized the Americas.